All my life, I chose simplicity. I didn't chase fancy cars, designer clothes, or big vacations. I worked hard, saved quietly, and lived in a modest farmhouse at the edge of town. To my family, I was the odd one out, the plain one. The one they pitied behind tight smiles and whispered jokes at family gatherings. They laughed at my old truck. They rolled their eyes at my worn boots. They thought I lived small because I had to, not because I chose to. But while they spent and flashed and showed off, I built something solid. What they didn't know was that the land under their shiny new houses, their manicured lawns, their precious little cul-de-sacs, it all belonged to me. And when the time came, when the disrespect piled too high to ignore, they learned the truth. Simplicity isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the foundation you never saw coming. Has anyone ever mistaken your quiet strength for weakness, only to realize you held more power than they ever imagined? Share your story in the comments and subscribe for more real-life tales of dignity, resilience, and justice found in unexpected ways. I was born and raised in the same small town where I still live today, a place where fields stretch wider than highways and a handshake once meant more than a contract. My parents weren't wealthy, but they were steady, working the land, saving what little they could, teaching me the value of patience over flash. I took those lessons to heart. While my siblings dreamed of city lights and fast lives, I stayed put. I worked odd jobs, saved every penny, and lived modestly. No fancy vacations, no high-interest credit cards, no designer clothes. I drove the same rusted truck for 20 years, wore boots until the soles worn thin, and chose my old farmhouse over the glimmer of something bigger. At family gatherings, the jokes started early and stayed late. Maybe one day you'll join the modern world. Still wearing those same boots, huh? You know, there's a thing called online shopping now. They laughed while flaunting new houses, flashy SUVs, and vacations to resorts they couldn't truly afford. I smiled along, not because their jokes didn't sting, but because I knew something they didn't. See, while they chased appearances, I had been quietly making moves. When the local farmer who owned half the town's acreage passed away, I bought a stretch of land most thought was worthless. Overgrown fields, tucked away behind the developing neighborhoods. I bought it cheap, piece by piece, while my siblings were busy building houses on the shiny new lots just beyond. They never asked who owned the land their developments pressed up against. Why would they? In their eyes, I was barely keeping up with them, much less leading anything. But that land, those acres of wild, untamed ground, held more power than they ever realized. It was the kind of power that didn't need a flashy announcement or a public show. It simply waited, patient, a seed beneath the soil. And when the time came, that quiet investment, the one they mocked without even knowing, would grow into something none of them could ignore. Life went on, and the gap between my world and my siblings' world widened. They filled their homes with gadgets I didn't understand, drove cars that needed payments larger than my monthly grocery bill, and spent weekends posting pictures from expensive brunches and designer outlets. At every family gathering, they wore their success like a badge. They pitied me, thinking I had somehow missed the train to a better life. I was the afterthought, the simpleton who lived on the wrong side of the town that was growing shinier by the year. What they didn't know was that the town's growth was my opportunity. See, the city planners had a vision. Expand. Push past the neat suburban edges. New shopping centers, better schools, wider roads. And to do that, they needed land. The kind of land no one had thought twice about. Until now. My land. Quietly, over the years, I had expanded my holdings. A little here, a little there. Sometimes paying off elderly owners who wanted to move closer to family, sometimes scooping up tax-defaulted plots for pennies on the dollar. Bit by bit, I had stitched together a patchwork of ownership that covered more ground than any one developer had anticipated. By the time they noticed, it was too late. One afternoon, I got a call from a man representing a major real estate company. He wanted to discuss opportunities for my acreage. His voice was smooth, professional, full of the assumption that a small-timer like me would jump at the chance to cash out. I listened, politely, and then I declined. I wasn't ready to sell, not yet. Because while I could have taken a comfortable payout and disappeared, I realized there was something far sweeter on the horizon. My siblings, in their rush to build bigger and better, had never paid attention to zoning laws, future road expansions, or who actually controlled the access routes to their prized neighborhoods. Without my land, the city couldn't expand the road their community desperately needed. Without my land, the schools they bragged about would remain overcrowded. Without my permission, the shopping centers they were counting on would be delayed, indefinitely. In short, they needed me, and they had no idea. Until one Sunday afternoon, when the whole family gathered for a barbecue at my brother's sprawling new house. Plates piled high with food, kids running across the manicured lawn, music playing too loud. That's when the letter arrived. Official, formal, from the city, notifying them that pending road expansion projects required easement agreements and negotiations with the primary landowner of the adjacent property. Me, their simple, quiet, worn-booted sister. The realization hit slowly at first, curious glances, murmured questions, frowns forming like thunderclouds. "Wait," my brother said finally, holding the letter in his hand, looking at me like he was seeing a ghost. "You own that land?" I smiled, steady and calm. "Have for years." The silence that followed was thick enough to stand on. All those years they mocked my simplicity, pitied my plain life, bragged about how far ahead they were, and now they realized the ground under their very lives was mine. Literally. And for the first time, I wasn't the one left standing in someone else's shadow. I was the one casting it. After the truth came out, the mood among my family shifted almost. Overnight, the teasing stopped, replaced by strained politeness and awkward silences whenever I entered the room. I could feel the weight of their unease pressing down at every gathering, seeing it flicker in their glances, their tight smiles. It didn't take long for the phone calls to start. First came my brother, Alan, the one who once joked that my truck belonged in a museum. He called late one evening, voice syrupy sweet, asking how I was doing, mentioning how he'd love to sit down and chat about opportunities. I smiled as I listened, remembering every chuckle he shared at my expense. "Maybe another time," I said coolly, ending the call without apology. Then came my sister Beth, who had once snickered about my outdated boots at Christmas dinner. She dropped by unannounced one afternoon, carrying a pie she had clearly bought from the supermarket. She perched on my porch swing, complimenting the charm of my old farmhouse she used to openly mock, then casually brought up the easement issue, how it was causing unnecessary stress for her and her neighbors. "If you could just sign a few papers," she said, her voice lilting like a woman offering a favor, not asking for one. I leaned back in my chair, letting her words hang in the warm afternoon air. "And what exactly are you offering me in return?" I asked. Beth blinked, caught off guard. She wasn't used to me setting terms. I was supposed to be the agreeable one, the simple one, the family afterthought. Not anymore. When she stammered something about doing the right thing, I smiled, a slow, steady smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I am doing the right thing," I said. "For me." Word got around fast after that. Suddenly, distant cousins, old family friends, even my brother's in-laws, people who had barely noticed me before, started reaching out. Some pleaded, some tried guilt, a few tried subtle threats about family loyalty. But the thing about loyalty is, it has to be a two-way street, and mine had been a dead end for years. Meanwhile, the city's pressure mounted. Without my easement approval, Their whole development plans stalled. Roads couldn't be widened. Businesses withdrew interest. School board members started fielding angry calls from parents. And my siblings, who once thought they owned the town by association, now found themselves boxed in, literally. At one point, a lawyer representing the Homeowners Association even reached out, trying to intimidate me into compliance. I forwarded the letter to my attorney without a second thought. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't looking to make a scene. I was looking for acknowledgement, respect. If they couldn't give it willingly, then they'd have to live with the reality they built, the reality I had shaped underneath, their very foundations. Every barbecue, every birthday party, every smug conversation they once had in their big houses now stood on borrowed ground. My ground, and no amount of charm, guilt, or legal maneuvering could change that. They thought simplicity was a weakness. They were wrong. Simplicity had been my shield, my strength, and now my victory. For years, I had carried the weight of being the outsider in my own family. Every joke, every sideways glance, every backhanded compliment had stacked itself neatly on my shoulders. I bore it all quietly, convincing myself it was easier to smile than to speak, easier to blend in than to stand tall. But now, with the truth laid bare, I found myself in a place I had never been before. Center stage, not because I demanded it, but because they had no choice but to look at me. At first, I thought vindication would feel sweet. I imagined myself basking in the glow of long overdue respect. But the truth was quieter, heavier. It didn't come with cheers or applause. It came with a steady, solemn understanding that the girl they once pitied was the woman who had outlasted them all. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free, free from needing their approval, free from pretending their smallness was my own, free from shrinking to fit a mold that never belonged to me. I realized that my simplicity, the very thing they mocked, had been my greatest strength all along. It had taught me patience when they were impatient, restraint when they were reckless. It had allowed me to invest, to build slowly, to create something real while they raced toward illusions of success. I didn't rub it in their faces. I didn't boast or brag. I didn't need to, because true power doesn't announce itself. It simply exists, quiet, unshakable. The more I leaned into that truth, the less I worried about mending the fractured pieces of our family dynamic. I didn't need to be the fixer anymore. I didn't need to force closeness where none existed. If respect and love came from my family now, they would come without conditions. Otherwise, I would keep living my life, grounded on land that was mine, not just by paper, but by patience, wisdom, and earned perseverance. Sometimes, silence says more than 1,000 speeches. And as I sat on my porch in the evenings, watching the sun dip behind the fields I had so carefully, quietly claimed, I felt a peace deeper than any apology could offer. I hadn't changed. I had simply stopped hiding. Once the dust settled, things around town took on a new shape. Where once my siblings moved freely, throwing barbecues and hosting neighborhood parties like royalty, now they moved more carefully, like people who finally understood the ground beneath their feet wasn't theirs to command. And I went on with my life exactly as I always had. Simple, steady, and deliberate. I tended my garden, repaired my old truck, and visited the farmer's market every Saturday. If anyone thought it strange that I didn't cash in, that I didn't sell the land to the highest bidder, they didn't say it out loud. Maybe they assumed I was holding out for more money, for a bigger payday. But the truth was simpler. I wasn't holding out for anything. I was holding firm. Because sometimes keeping what you built is a bigger victory than selling it for applause. Offers continued to pour in, developers waving checks with more zeros than I'd ever seen in my life. But every time I walked the edge of those fields, every time I watched the breeze ripple through the tall grass, I knew the answer was still no. This land had been laughed at, overlooked, dismissed, just like me. and like me, it had endured. One afternoon, my nephew, a teenager with more sense than most of the adults in the family, found me sitting under the big oak tree near the edge of the property. He shuffled his feet, nervous, a baseball cap twisting in his hands. "Uncle Joe said you're mad at everyone," he blurted. I smiled gently. "I'm not mad. I'm just done pretending I'm less than I am." He frowned, thinking hard. "Are you gonna kick them out?" I chuckled. "No, kiddo. They're safe. I'm not out for revenge. I'm just not handing out favors to people who don't know how to say thank you." He nodded slowly, digesting that. Then, after a beat, he said, "I think it's kinda cool. You're like the boss, but without being mean about it." Out of the mouths of babes, they say. That conversation stayed with me. Because it was true. I didn't need to punish anyone. Life had already taught its lesson, and if some of my family members were uncomfortable now, if they squirmed when they passed me at the grocery store or offered stiff nods at town meetings, that wasn't my burden to carry. Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you command, by how you live, how you endure, how you refuse to shrink. Over time, things began to change in small, quiet ways. A cousin stopped by to drop off a pie, no strings attached. A niece invited me to her school play. A neighbor who had always ignored me now waved from across the fence. They weren't grand gestures, but they were real, and I accepted them without bitterness, without suspicion. Not because I needed their approval anymore, but because forgiveness, like patience, was something I had learned to cultivate in abundance. I had built a life they couldn't tear down with laughter. And when the next big town project came up and the city council sent another eager letter requesting access through my land, I smiled, folded it carefully, and tucked it away. I wasn't rushing to say yes. I wasn't rushing to say no. I was simply letting them wait. Because real power, the kind built on patience, dignity, and quiet resolve, doesn't shout. It waits, and it decides, on its own terms. Just when I thought things had settled, the second wave came, and this time it hit harder. The Homeowners Association, now desperate, decided they couldn't wait for my good graces. They petitioned the town council to initiate an eminent domain case against my land. In plain words, they wanted the town to force a sale, claiming it was for the greater public good. I received the notice on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter heavy in my hands, reading and rereading the thaw. Official, clinical language meant to make me feel small. But small was something I no longer answered to. I called my attorney immediately. He was younger than me, sharp as a tack, and had the kind of quiet fury reserved for people who knew how wrong the world could sometimes be. "We'll fight it," he said without hesitation, "and we'll win." And we did. Over the next several months, I sat through hearing after hearing. I watched my siblings squirm in courtrooms, pretending not to see me. I listened as their lawyers spun stories about how the town needed my land for progress, how the children deserved new roads and parks, how my simple, stubborn existence was somehow holding back the bright future they deserved. They didn't say my name, of course. They didn't have to. I was the ghost in every sentence. But I didn't flinch. I sat straight-backed, hands folded neatly, wearing my oldest boots to every meeting like armor. Because what they didn't understand, what they never understood, was that simplicity is not weakness. Simplicity is clarity. Simplicity is strength refined to its purest form. My attorney presented our case calmly, methodically. He showed how the land had historical value, how it served as a protected green space, how I had maintained it diligently for years. He exposed every corner the association had tried to cut, every assumption they had made that no one would stand in their way. And little by little, the tide turned. The council members, once eager to push expansion, began to shift. Public opinion grew louder, not from my family, of course. but from everyday townsfolk who respected a person's right to their property, their work, their life. Letters to the editor popped up in the local paper, calling the eminent domain attempt a disgrace, a betrayal of our values. People who had once overlooked me now stood in quiet, firm solidarity. When the final hearing came, I stood before the council and spoke plainly. I've lived here my whole life. I didn't build my life to get rich. I didn't build it to make anyone jealous. I built it because this land matters, because patience matters, because respect matters. And if you take that away for convenience, you lose more than land. You lose your soul. The room was silent when I finished, not because my words were loud, but because they were true. 3 weeks later, the town council voted unanimously in my favor. The eminent domain petition was denied. My land remained mine. No forced sale. No hollow victory for those who thought they could erase me. Afterward, there was no celebration, no parade. Just a quiet evening back home, a slow walk across the fields, the breeze whispering through the tall grass. I had stood my ground, literally and figuratively, and the ones who once mocked my simplicity now had to live with the truth they could no longer ignore. I wasn't the weak one. I was the foundation they had always mistaken for something disposable, and now I was the one who endured. After the council's decision, the silence from my family was deafening. No calls, no emails, no awkward drop-ins with store-bought pies. I didn't expect anything different. Pride is a powerful thing, especially when it's built on a foundation of appearances. To acknowledge me now, to admit that the sister they had once pitied had bested them with nothing but patience and quiet strength, would mean confronting a truth they weren't ready to face. And that was fine by me. I didn't need their recognition anymore. I had built my life on deeper soil than that. The town slowly returned to its rhythm. Development projects adjusted their plans. Roads curved around my fields instead of cutting through them. New parks were designed with my land as a backdrop, a living reminder that not all progress is paved over the past. Neighbors stopped by more often, offering thanks, offering respect. Some brought baskets of vegetables from their gardens. Others simply waved from their porches, a silent nod that said more than any apology could. As for me, I kept living as I always had. Simple, steady, free. I repaired the old fence that bordered the north field. I hosted Sunday picnics for the kids from the local school, letting them run wild across the open spaces their parents had nearly lost. I planted new trees along the western slope, thinking of the generations that might sit in their shade long after I was gone. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and the air turned cool with the promise of fall, I stood on my porch and realized something profound. In the end, it wasn't about winning against my family. It was about winning back my own worth, the kind that no amount of ridicule or dismissal could take away. I had spent a lifetime being underestimated, laughed at, pushed aside. But now, rooted in the very ground they once overlooked, I had built something no one could uproot. And I had. Done it the way I lived, quietly, simply, and without apology. As the seasons changed, so did I. Not loudly, not dramatically, just like the leaves turning gold, I shifted into a version of myself that no longer needed to explain, defend, or prove anything to anyone. The town slowly forgot the noise of the battle that had unfolded. The new school was built a few miles away, safely beyond my fields. The new shopping center found another plot to develop. Life moved on, as it always does. But for me, something fundamental had settled deep into my bones. A quiet, steady pride that didn't depend on anyone's validation. My family stayed distant for the most part. A few tentative attempts were made, holiday invitations with careful wording, neutral greetings at town events, but I kept my boundaries firm. Not out of spite, not out of anger, out of love for the life I had built. A life where my worth isn't measured by appearances, by money, or by how well I fit someone else's idea of success. It was measured in the soft creak of my porch swing at sunset, in the strong roots of the oak trees I had planted, in the steady beat of a heart that had finally, fully chosen itself. And that was more than enough. There's a freedom that comes from being misunderstood. When people write you off, they stop watching, they stop expecting, and in that blind spot, you find space to build something real, something no one can take away. For years, I let their laughter define me, even if I never said it aloud. I let the snickers at my old truck, my simple clothes, my plain life seep into the cracks of my self-worth. It's easy to start believing that maybe they're right, that maybe the loudest voices must also be the truest. But life has a funny way of turning things on their head. What they called failure was actually foresight. What they mocked as simplicity was strategy. And the patience they confused with passivity was, all along, the slow and steady hand that built a future stronger than anything they could imagine. I don't hate them for it. Truly, I don't. People cling to illusions because illusions are easy. It's easier to mock the quiet man or woman in the corner than to question what your own noise is hiding. Easier to believe success wears expensive suits and shiny shoes than to recognize it sometimes shows up in worn boots and calloused hands. I didn't win by fighting them. I won by refusing to fight at all, by letting my life speak louder than their words ever could. Now, when I walk, the land, the fields golden in the late afternoon sun, the old trees standing tall and certain, I think about legacy. Not the kind you write down in history books, but the kind you live. Legacy isn't what people say about you at parties. It's what remains long after the noise fades. It's the land that stays rooted, the lessons that outlive you, the quiet dignity that grows stronger with every passing year. Someday, when I'm long gone, maybe someone else will sit under the oak trees I planted. Maybe they'll drive by the fields I refused to sell and wonder about the stubborn old soul who loved this place enough to fight for it without ever raising her voice. Maybe they'll understand what my family never did. That real strength doesn't need to announce itself. It simply endures. Have you ever been underestimated only to rise stronger, quieter, and on your own terms? Share your story in the comments. Your quiet strength might inspire someone who's still finding their voice. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories where dignity, patience, and true resilience always find their way home.